Hello and welcome to another episode of Across the Frontier. So in the last two episodes, as you know, we have discussed Nepal and Bangladesh. So this in this episode we'll be discussing Sri Lanka. So Sri Lanka, as you know, is a neighboring country which gained independence from the British in 1948. It was known as Ceylon then. Then in 1956, so what we are going to discuss is the broad Sinhalese-Tamil conflict in Sri Lanka. So it starts with certain events in Sri Lanka. For example, in 1956, the Sinhala Only Act was passed, where Tamil was not given the status of a uh, language or of an official language or तमिल को शासन या आधिकारिक रूप में और आधिकारिक उद्देश्यों के वजह में तमिल को नहीं लिया गया, उसको मान्यता नहीं दी गई. And then there was this 1971 where a standardization policy was adopted, and where, for example, in entrance exams, Tamil students had higher cutoffs and so on. 1972, the country was called renamed as Sri Lanka, and it also led to a big wave of Buddhist nationalism. And then in 1975, this person called Prabhakaran emerges. He assassinates the mayor of Jaffna, and it starts the LTT in 1950s. And the LTT starts in 1976, which is a Tamil nationalist organization. And it also leads to different kinds of uh, counter रिएक्शंस इन बहुत सारी प्रतिक्रियाएं भी सीनरीज पॉपुलेशन की तरफ से मिलती है, और 1983 में जाके ये बहुत ही भयानक सांप्रदायिक दंगों में परिवर्तित होती है. तो इसी के बारे में हम बातचीत करेंगे. सो लेट्स स्टार्ट विद 1983, राइट?
Sure. And as you rightly say that over the years, there have been several outbreak of violence, but none so perhaps the most seminal and the greatest period violence of that outbreak of violence at that period must be the riots which happened in July of 1983. Um, Unlike most other instances, of course, this was a riot which was primarily instigated by the army. उन श्रीलंकन सेना के जवानों ने कुछ दिनों पहले एक एलटीटी के साथ मुठभेड़ में उनके 13 जवान मारे गए, और इस ये जो रायट हुआ ये उसी का ही उसी की ही प्रतिक्रिया हिसाब से माना जाता है उसको. सो that was one of the worst outbreak of riots. People were identified. The mobs went around with voter cards, voter lists, and which was believed to have been provided to them by the Sinhalese political leaders. Because, I mean, physically both Sinhalese and Tamils used to be indistinguishable. So they identified the Tamils from the buses. Landlords specifically identified tenants, Tamil tenants, and it left a trail of violence and across entire Colombo. It primarily
Yeah,
was limited to Colombo. Of course, it spread afterwards to other parts of the country.
yeah. So
Uh,
this timeline around 83, so it kind of reminds me of similar kind of incidents in 1984 in India during the Sikh riots as well, right?
mhm.
So and also like the events that followed in Punjab. But this is just like I don't want to distract you, but I just wanted to draw a parallel.
That's indeed right. And in fact, in what I consider to be quite unique in this respect is there was also there's also violence in one of Sri Lanka's prisons, in which 37 Tamil prisoners were killed as a result of a skirmish between the Sinhalese prisoners and the Tamil prisoners. So you
It
can
was a
see the
prisoner fight, right? Like it's not a
yes, exactly.
so it,
Exactly. So it was also so you can see the communal lines which have been which had been drawn at that time in Sri Lanka, caused by the polarization which happened. So I'll, so that's the background. That's slightly into the background of the 1983 July riots, considered to be uh, possibly one of the biggest events that led to a surge in LTT's ranks. Right, the LTT, which is which was a driver of the uh, Sri Lankan civil war,
या
the Sri Lanka Sinhalese-Tamil civil war.
जहाँ तक मुझे ये पता है कि अराउंड 3000 तमिल्स probably lost their lives.
Mhm.
और ये भी है कि बहुत सारा डिस्प्लेसमेंट भी हुआ और इससे एलटीटी को जो द जो बैकिंग मिलने चाहिए थी, दे गॉट अ वेरी गुड कॉमन कॉज. Of course, the LTT existed before, but they found a new ground because of these riots.
That's true. In fact, it's considered to be the recruiting rallying point of LTT. That जुलाई के बाद उनको भारत का भी उनको सहयोग मिला और एलटीटी के कैडर्स भी बहुत हद तक भारत में भी ट्रेन किए गए उस वक्त. बट
हाँ,
हम उससे जरा सा पहले की बात भी करते हैं जो उस तात्कालीन जो श्रीलंका के जो राष्ट्रपति थे जयवर्धने के बारे में. सो अ वेरी यूनिक फिगर एंड आई जस्ट वांटेड टू टॉक अबाउट इट बिकॉज इट
ये
इज
नेतृत्व के बारे में बात करते हैं. लेट्स टॉक अबाउट द लीडरशिप अराउंड दैट टाइम एंड लेट्स टॉक अबाउट जयवर्धन. या
Yeah. So Jayavardhana actually was interestingly a Buddhist convert, right? He was an Anglican who converted into Buddhism earlier in his political career, and he, quite like his predecessor, also brought a new constitution. तो श्रीलंका में उसके पहले अ, जो प्रधानमंत्री था मेनली वो एग्जीक्यूटिव प्रधानमंत्री हुआ करता था बट जयवर्धने वाज द पर्सन हु ब्रॉट एन एग्जीक्यूटिव प्रेसिडेंसी. और उनके दौरान एक्चुअली उस दौरान वो बहुत ज्यादा धर्म के बारे में बात करते थे या निष्ठा के बारे में बात करते थे. सो द गवर्नमेंट दैट दे पोजीशन वाज sort of a righteous government. So
हाँ,
a lot of
जो नामकरण हुआ, इट चेंज फ्रॉम सीलन टू श्रीलंका, और जो
Mhm.
बौद्ध राष्ट्रवाद का जो एक लहर चली, उसी के परिप्रेक्ष्य में हम इसको देख सकते हैं. वी कैन लुक एट इट इन दैट पर्सपेक्टिव, राइट?
Absolutely, yes. I mean, Sri Lanka, as you rightly said, that the renaming did happen in Sirimavo Bandaranaike's time, but that policy did continue even under Jayawardene. So, a lot of
Can you
patronizing of the.
give me a very brief introduction to what was the political environment around at the time? For example, like who were the opponents of Jayavardhan and so on?
Sure. Yeah. So Jayavardhana actually, an Anglican convert into Buddhism, was came from the UNP, the United National Party, and his primary opponent was the opposing party was the SLFP, the Sri Lankan Freedom Party. So until 1977, when he won the election, until then it was an alternate system of government. एक बार उनकी सरकार बनती है SLFP श्रीलंकन फ्रीडम पार्टी की सरकार बनती है. दूसरी बार संयुक्त राष्ट्रीय पार्टी जो यूएनपी है उसकी सरकार बनती है. सो इट वाज दैट यूज्ड टू हैपन until then, and most of these governments used to be coalition governments, right? The 1977 mandate was very much in favor of Jayawardene. So it won a very strong mandate. SLFP was almost उसका सफाया हो गया था और जो प्राइमरी ऑपोजिशन पार्टी थी वो तमिल पार्टी थी. ठीक है. सो एसएलएफपी वाज ऑलमोस्ट वाइप्ड आउट इन दैट पर्टिकुलर इलेक्शन. सो उस दौरान जो जयवर्धने का सरकार बना उनको एक बहुत बहु भारी बहुमत उनको मिला. And so he brought the executive presidency. So now the Jayawardene, as his government in power, I mean, that was an extension of a projection of his own personality. उन्होंने जो Sinhalese Buddhist shrine से उसमें उन्होंने they had, of course, there was a separate Buddhist department even before Jayawardhane's time, but it was actively sponsored, and they set up a lot of shrines. Monks को जो है उनके monks के powerful lobbies बने और श्रीलंका जयवर्धन खुद एक श्रीलंका वन सिन्हलीज लैंग्वेज ऑफिशियल लैंग्वेज पॉलिसी के भी समर्थक थे. तो वो एक्चुअली बट कुछ कुछ जयवर्धनी के ये हम जरूर मान सकते हैं कि बुद्धिस्ट श्राइन्स और उनके मॉन्क्स को ज्यादातर सपोर्ट मिली. बट वन वेरी क्रिटिकल थिंग, जयवर्धन मेड श्योर दैट मॉन्क्स ही ट्राई टू प्रिवेंट मॉन्क्स फ्रॉम एंटरिंग द पॉलिटिकल लाइफ. ठीक है.
Okay.
So in order to understand the sway of Buddhism, we probably might have to go a little bit into the past.
Yeah, that's fine. So, so we have this ultra Buddhist presidency of Jayawardena, and then you have these riots in 1983. So I think before we understand the entire picture, right, we should go back to uh, history, or go back to the past, and go back mostly to probably the initial around the 18th century, where we just look at different kinds of Sinhalese-Tamil divisions that had been happening, and also like the British role in accentuating it.
Yes, indeed. So Sinhalese, I mean, contrary to what is supposed in the 20th century and of course at the time of the Civil War, when the divisions became much more entrenched, it wasn't the case until 18th century. So उस दौरान Sinhalese तमिल के बीच में जरूर of course they had their opposing viewpoints of history. जैसे Sinhalese मांगते हैं कि वो लोग जो कुमार विजय है उनसे उनके वंशज है वो लोग. At the same time, Tamils they consider themselves to be well, some the oldest inhabitants of Sri Lanka, and they consider that Sinhalese have actually originated from them. But
Also, there's one more division that I would like to point out.
mhm.
Sinhalese is basically an Indo-Aryan language, unlike
Yes, I mean, yeah. So the ethnic division, that's true. So I mean, the ethnic division did come much later. So Sinhalese is like it's considered it came from Pali and then Tamil, but Tamil's was a Dravidian language for sure. But uh, an exact ethnic division of both those languages, it's contested, like whether that did really happen. But certainly, as you rightly pointed out, that it's an Indo-Aryan language. But uh, the linguistic sensibilities या जो भाषा के मतलब भाषा को लेकर जो उनमें मतभेद होते थे वो उस दौरान नहीं थे. So in the early 18th century, actually there was wide division. So what is considered the last independent Sinhalese kingdom before the coming of British, वो कैंडी में या कांदियन जो राज्य था उसको कहा जाता है. Very interestingly, this in popular Sinhalese history, it's considered to be the last bastion of independent Sinhalese rule. बट ये जो कैंडी के जो राजा थे वो लोग खुद उनके जो particularly the last rulers of Kandy, they had connections with साउदर्न इंडिया राइट. सो नायकर बोलकर जो उनके राजा थे उनसे उनका कनेक्शन रहता था. एंड these kings have also sponsored and also funded a lot of Buddhist shrines, built temples, funded temples and so on. बट उस दौरान भी हम सिंहलीज और तमिल के डिवीजन को वैसे उनमें डिवीजन नहीं मान सकते क्योंकि कुछ तमिल्स थे जो उनको श्रीलंकन तमिल्स जो लिव स्टेड अराउंड द कोस्टल एरियाज जिसको लो कंट्री तमिल्स बोलते हैं, ठीक है. और जो अप कंट्री तमिल्स है जो मेनली एस्टेट में काम करते थे, मतलब अवे फ्रॉम द कोस्टल एरियाज इन दोज पार्ट. सो द in those at that time when there used to be those demographic census, so low country up country Tamils unme they used to be considered as separate communities, like not a single monolith of Tamils. Also, like within Sinhalese, like there are different castes, like Durava caste का मुझे याद आ रहा है या वैसे तरीके के who consider themselves Sinhalese, but they themselves spoke Tamils. They themselves spoke Tamil, right?
You're talking about uh, the Tamils right now. You're talking about Sri Lankan Tamils in Sri Lanka, or are you
Mhm.
also talking about the Indian Tamils in Sri Lanka?
Indian Tamils, estate Tamils, which mainly came with the British, right? So
Okay.
the British, so since the British were working with, also considered cultivation in this estate, so they brought those Indian Tamils who were or the estate Tamils, right? So to work there. In fact, जब ब्रिटिश ने 1815 सन को जब उन्होंने formally then they took up the last bastion of what is called the Sinhalese kingdom, कांडियन किंगडम को जब उन्होंने ले लिया था उस दौरान जब कैंडी के जो राजा थे उन्होंने इनफैक्ट दे साइन द ट्रीटी इन तमिल, right, even though they consider themselves to be Sinhalese. So there were not such ethnic divisions between Sinhalese and Tamils. A lot of people who consider themselves Sinhalese spoke Tamils at home, and of course there's also the other population of Moors or Muslims who
Yeah.
consider themselves to be separate from Sinhalese and Tamils but who also did speak Tamil, right. Now if we
So, what
consider,
happened during the British rule? Let's jump to the British rule now, I guess.
sure. So, as I mentioned, that British started work on the estates and they began importing labor from southern India, right? So that was still not a point of conflict. The British had their legislative and the executive council, जहाँ पे समुदाय हिसाब से जहाँ पे रिप्रेजेंटेशन हुआ करता था। तो कोई अगर लो कंट्री तमिल है उसको उसका रिप्रेजेंटेशन भी था एग्जीक्यूटिव काउंसिल में, कोई अप कंट्री तमिल था उसका था, सिन्हैली पॉपुलेशन उनका था, मूर या बर्गर्स उनका भी रिप्रेजेंटेशन हुआ करता था। सो इट मोर और लेस फंक्शनड as a composite setup in this executive councils. लेकिन 1920 शताब्दी में 1920 सन में डॉनमोर संविधान आया। सो डॉनमोर या ब्रिटिश ने संविधान तब लाया, एंड एट दैट टाइम द आइडिया ऑफ कम्युनल रिप्रेजेंटेशन टू अ लिमिटेड एक्सटेंट इट वाज देयर, बट इट वाज मोस्टली ड्रॉप्ड। सो ब्रिटिश का जो नेशन स्टेट का कॉन्सेप्ट है कि यूरोप में आप जैसे देखते हैं कि अलग अलग देश है, जर्मनी है, इंग्लैंड है, जो भाषा के को लेकर जो
हिसाब से।
राष्ट्र बने हैं। Right. So they brought that concept of nation state even to Sri Lanka, right? Or they even probably even brought this to India. But
Yes.
उस दौरान actually, so upcountry, low country Tamil, we consider they club them together as, let's say, Tamils. The division was there, but more or less Tamils को they identified as a unique quantity, or like Sinhalese के बीच में भी वो division नहीं रहा. Even the territories that were marked out for elections, उस दौरान electorates were based on the territory. So ये territory, suppose Sinhalese territory है, वो Tamil territory है, ऐसे करके those were marked out. So the division became much more entrenched. Now 1900 uh, and that was actually, I'm talking about the 1920s and 1930s. उस उस दौरान the Tamils were like to be honest, they were much more literate population, even though the general literacy of Sri Lanka were much more was much good, but Tamils आप उनको दे तो वो ज्यादातर अंग्रेजी बोलने वाले या अंग्रेजी भाषा की जानकारी रखने वाले उनमें संख्या ज्यादा थी. So they mostly used to occupy those elite positions around the British
Many
era.
people went more for higher education. So if you look at the Tamil population in Sri Lanka, they were more likely to go to higher education than the Sinhalese population.
That's true. That's indeed true. And in fact, come independence in 1948. So at the first government which was formed, that was Dudley's the Senya Naike government, and that was when the estate Tamils or Joe Indian Tamils, so they were completely disenfranchised. They were not considered to be Sinhalese anymore, right? So they're not considered to be Sri Lanka's citizens anymore. Uske baad, that was the primary start, I would say, the genesis of that conflict there. And
Uh,
then,
you're talking about just after independence of Sri Lanka, right?
yes, I'm talking right around 1948.
So what happened in the 50s then, right? Like in the 50s, for example, they started again, as I started stated in the introduction, that they started this Sinhala Only Act, Sinhalese Only Act. इस अधिनियम के अनुसार तमिल तमिल भाषा को शासन या आधिकारिक उद्देश्यों के लिए मान्यता नहीं दी गई. तो इसके बारे में ये सब जो इनिशियली जो ये डिवीजन जो स्टार्ट हुआ उसका कोई इमीडिएट कारण या इज देयर एनी प्रॉक्सिमेट रीजन और एनी इमीडिएट रीजन फॉर दैट?
Yeah, sure. So the people, like the main political leaders around the time, like Sena Naike of UNP or SLFP, Sri Lankan Freedom Party के जो उनके opponents, Sri Lankan Freedom Party के Mr. Bandar Naike, SRV Bandar Naike. So they, Mr. Sena Naike, for example, was also member of those executive council around these 30s. So Zoran, actually, as I said, like the primary change in consciousness that happened, that there were the Sri Lanka, the Sinhalese and the Tamils were ethnically different. That happened sometime in the 1930s. Actually, immediate कारण उसका बताओ तो P अरुणाचलम बोलकर एक कैंडिडेट थे तमिल स्पीकिंग भाई साहब थे, तो जिन्होंने इलेक्शन जीता, एंड ही वाज अ रिप्रेजेंटेटिव फॉर बोथ द सिनालीज एंड द तमिल्स, राइट? सो दैट proved to be an immediate factor, if I would say, in the 1930s. So but that's where the ethnic division started appearing. But 1948 के बाद actually they brought the Sinhala. Actually 1956 में जब Mr. Bandar Naike came to power for the first time, that time he brought the Sinhala on the act. So जैसे आपने बताया that it was considered to be an official language, only official language of the government. However, at that time there were widespread protests in the Tamil among the Tamil-speaking people, and as a result of that, there was a pact which happened between the federal party, जो तमिल लोगों के हित के लिए काम करता था और उसके नेता थे मिस्टर सेल्वा नायकम। तो
जी।
सेल्वा नायकम और बंदर नायके के बीच में एक पैक्ट हुआ उस दौरान। बट एज अ रिजल्ट ऑफ दैट पैक्ट के दौरान एक्चुअली उसमें समझौता तो जो हुआ उसके दौरान उसमें कहा गया कि तमिल विद्यालयों में तमिल भाषा का प्रयोग किया जाएगा और सिन्हालीज विद्यालयों में सिन्हालीज का प्रयोग किया जाएगा। बट ऑफ कोर्स दैट वाज सम कंसेशन ऑन पार्ट ऑफ द लीडर्स। Soon after that, there were widespread protests mostly among the Sinhalese Buddhist lobby in the party, and so that pact also broke out. और जैसे कि मैंने बताया कि ये एक बहुत ज्यादा सिनालिस बुद्धिस्ट फैक्शन, हमें ध्यान भी रखना होगा कि जयवर्धने जो थे, जे जयवर्धने जो बाद में 1977 में जो राष्ट्रपति बने, वो मिस्टर सेना नायके के वित्त मंत्री भी थे उस सरकार में। एंड ही वाज वन ऑफ द प्रोपोनेंट्स ऑफ द सिन्हाला ऑन द पॉलिसी। तो वो भी उन्होंने भी इसका विरोध किया, जो पैक्ट बना था उसका विरोध किया। और 1965 में देयर वाज अनदर दैट वाज द टाइम व्हेन द गवर्नमेंट अगेन चेंज, फिर से यूएनपी की सरकार बनी, सेना नायके की सरकार बनी। उस दौरान सेल्वा नायकम जो तमिल नेता थे उनके और सेना नायके के बीच में और एक समझौता हुआ। एंड दैट वाज व्हेन द फर्स्ट आइडिया ऑफ डिस्ट्रिक्ट काउंसिल्स, जिसके बारे में हम बात करेंगे थोड़ी देर में।
आती है
डिस्ट्रिक्ट
60
काउंसिल
60s की
सिक्सटी
बात।
1965 की बात कर रहे हैं। 1965 में उसके बीच में दोबारा से समझौता है। उसके बाद उसका भी उसके उसके भी घोर प्रतिक्रिया हुई। द डिस्ट्रिक्ट काउंसिल्स फाइनली ब्रोक डाउन एंड one of the factors, so the Tamil primary representative of the Tamils at that time was Mr. Silvanayakam, और उनके जो फेडरल पार्टी है वो पार्टी के अगेंस्ट में द मेन contention of the Sinhalese parties was that it was a casteist party, right? The Tamil parties were casteist, तो उसमें एक सिर्फ एक स्पेसिफिक एक निर्दिष्ट एक समुदाय को ही सिर्फ पॉलिटिक्स में पोजीशन मिलता था, एंड द लोअर कास्ट फॉर एग्जांपल वर नॉट वेर इग्नोर्ड, व्हिच वाज नॉट एंटायरली करेक्ट, बिकॉज उस दौरान भी तमिल तमिल में दूसरे पार्टी भी आए, नॉट जस्ट द फेडरल पार्टी व्हिच कंसिडर देमसेल्व्स टू बी रिप्रेजेंटेटिव ऑफ द लोअर कास्ट, बट दैट बिकेम kind of a stick to beat the Tamil parties with. But and in 1965, like by that time, Mr. Bandar Naike had been assassinated by one of those fanatic, by the Sinhalese Buddhi fanatics, and then 65 में जब ये पैक्ट बना जिसमें डिस्ट्रिक्ट काउंसिल आया, उसके बाद 1970 में अगेन द गवर्नमेंट चेंज, उसमें श्री मावो बंदर नायके, श्रीमती बंदर नायके की सरकार बनी। वो भी गठबंधन
उसके बाद
सरकार थी।
फिर 71 में जो पॉलिसी लाई गई स्टैंडर्डाइजेशन
हम्म
की, जो
हम्म,
जो
जी।
मानक बनाए गए कि ऐसी नीति जिसमें एंट्रेंस एग्जाम्स प्रवेश परीक्षाओं में तमिल छात्रों के लिए कट ऑफ ऊपर रखे गए। तो ये सब चीज़ें जब होने लगी यूनिवर्सिटी एडमिशन्स में, जो काइंड ऑफ लाइक डिस्क्रिमिनेशन दैट द तमिल्स फेल्ट इन श्रीलंका, तो इसका कारण क्या है? मतलब व्हाई डिड मिसेस Bandaranaike also fall into this trap after her husband had signed a treaty?
Yeah, so actually, even though I would say Mr. Bandaranaike had signed the treaty, like Mr. Bandaranaike was also a conservative Sinhalese Buddhist leader. Like उनके दौरान, Mr. Bandaranaike के दौरान actually सोलोमन बंदरनायके, उनके दौरान जो बुद्धिस्ट पीरीवाना पीरीवेना कहते थे, मतलब एक तरह से मॉन्क स्कूल्स थे, तो उनको विश्वविद्यालय का स्टेटस मिला। So these monk schools became Pirivena, वो उनको they became like universities. They were recognized as universities, and they produced several generation of Buddhist monks who were into politics and into different parts of life. Right. So that's where actually the direct coming advent of Buddhist monks into politics really started. And then that happened more in Sri Mavo Bandanaike के समय में कि she formed a coalition government with this leftist parties, nationalist and leftist parties. And as you rightly said कि सिन्हाला पॉलिसी आया जिसमें स्टैंडर्डाइजेशन था तमिल छात्रों को के लिए। कट ऑफ मार्क्स वो बहुत ज्यादा बढ़ गए, इसीलिए बढ़ गए क्योंकि तब तक द तमिल was a population, in fact literacy, general literacy in Sri Lanka was always very good, but Tamil छात्रों में actually अंग्रेजी भाषा का ज्ञान ज़्यादा होने की वजह से वो ज़्यादातर सरकारी या नौकरियों में उनकी सफलता बहुत ज़्यादा थी। तो
वो ब्रिटिश के दौरान से ज़्यादा थी और वो कंटिन्यू हो रही थी, तो दे सॉ इट एज़ काइंड ऑफ लाइक ए पॉजिटिव discrimination from the
हुँ,
Sinhalese, but the Tamils obviously felt a lot of resentment about it.
दैट्स ट्रू एंड
बाद
सो
उसके बाद हम जयवर्धने में आते हैं और ये जो 1983 की बात हमने की थी, तो उसपे हम आगे बढ़ने वाले हैं।
जी, सो क्वाइट राइट। सो जयवर्धने से आने से पहले मैं एक्चुअली ज़रा-सा तमिल पार्टीज़ के बारे में बता रहा हूँ, उस दौरान के तमिल पार्टीज़ एंड देन विल ऑफ कोर्स कम टू जयवर्धने। तमिल जिस समय श्री मावो बंदरनायके की सरकार चल रही थी, एक्चुअली उस समय ये तमिल अलग-अलग नेता नेता जो थे या दूसरे तमिल पार्टीज़ जो थे, वो उस समय स्टार्ट हो रही थी। तो 1976 1976 का जो सन था, दैट वाज़ अ वेरी पर अ स्पेसिफिक ईयर, वेरी सिग्निफिकेंट ईयर, क्योंकि उसमें एक रेज़ोल्यूशन पास किया गया व्हिच इज़ कॉल्ड द वट्टुकोट्टाई रेज़ोल्यूशन। उस दौरान सबसे पहली बार सेल्वानायकम, जो तब तक जो पहले मंत्री भी रह चुके हैं और जो तमिल नेता भी थे, he formally supported the idea of a separate Tamil state as a
यस,
breakaway Tamil state. So 1976 में वो पहली बार हुआ and at that time all this Tamil, उसके पहले जरा सा पहले ही actually the LTT, the Tamil Tigers, which later turned out to be the most ferocious militant group in Sri Lanka, और
या
उसके साथ साथ दूसरे जो तमिल उग्रवादी संगठन थे उनका भी शुरुआत उसी टाइम से हुआ।
तो इस समय क्या हुआ कि जो तमिल पार्टीज़ थे, जो थोड़े बिखरे हुए थे, क्योंकि तमिल न्यू टाइगर्स बोल के ऑलरेडी एक फ़ोर्स था जो व्हिच वाज़ काइंड ऑफ लाइक ए मोर मिलिटेंट ऑर्गनाइज़ेशन। लेकिन
हम्म,
76 में एक काइंड ऑफ लाइक कंसेंसस टाइप का बन गया इवन अमंग तमिल पार्टीज़, जिसमें even the Democratic Tamil Party supported separatism, and in 1976 LTT was formed, right? And तो उससे पहले 75 में प्रभाकरन ने already he had assassinated the mayor of Jaffna. So this kind of like violent streak was always there, but in 76 there was like more widespread support for the movement.
that's true, yes. And in fact, there were several factions, not just LTT, but Plotty करके था, there was Tello, and various other groups. There was this Marxist militant groups and LTT, which was not really a Marxist group, but like proto-Marxism. It was kind of a proto-Marxist group, and they were competing, vying uh, uh, for predominance in this Tamil politics and in this era of arena of Tamil militancy. Now that change, that very much was going on, and this competitive interest, and then Jayavardhana came. I should say that of course Jayavardhana was also did give fillip to this Sinhalese Buddhist supremacy, but he did try to take back. To be fair to him, he did try to take back those Buddhist monks away from politics. So जो मैंने कहा था कि पीरिवेना को यूनिवर्सिटी विश्वविद्यालय का जो status मिला, वो actually he revoked that, right? So Pirivenas became, he said that monks should remain as the ideal emblem of Buddhism, and they should remain separate from politics.
Correct.
However, significant funding of Buddhist shrines, of monks, of their education did happen. In fact, he compiled an entire
तो इसके
जो
लिए हम आपको बैक करेंगे, हम आपके विल पे फॉर यू, विल पे फॉर द श्राइन्स, विल पे फॉर द मॉन्यूमेंट्स, but just don't become political animals, because I am the one who is like taking care of it.
Absolutely, he fashioned himself after in this ideals of Sri Lankan heroes. Like
Yeah.
अभी भी पॉपुलर हिस्ट्री में उनकी बात करो तो दुतुकामनो बोलकर एक श्री सेनालिस राजा हुआ करते थे इन आई थिंक सम टाइम इन सेकंड सेंचुरी और थर्ड सेंचुरी AD, or who had defeated a supposedly Tamil king. So he was fashioning Jayavardhana was fashioning himself more after Dutukamanu, and that caught the popular imagination of that time. Now, cut to 1981, or that saw one of the worst outbreak of violence was Soran Jaffna, जो कि उत्तरी श्रीलंका में है, and
77 में भी एक रायट हुआ था ना,
जी
1977 also there were riots between the Tamils and the Sinhalese in
Of course, yes.
pretty
1956, 1956, 1958, 1970, 70s and 1977 और then 1981. I'm talking mainly about 1981 क्योंकि उस दौरान जाफना का जो पुस्तकालय था that was burnt down and that was one of the main setbacks for the Tamil sentiments.
सो
Right?
सो
तो
जाफना लाइब्रेरी को जो जलाया गया, जो पुस्तकालय को जलाया गया, तो
जी
उसमें what was the probable motive behind it? Because it seems like a very it's kind of like a milestone incident, right? In terms of Sri
So a
Lankan.
lot of, as we discussed, like a lot of skirmishes were happening between the Tamils and the Sinhalese there. But Jayavardhane, the pitch of Sinhalese nationalism reached its peak during Jayavardhane's time, right? And it's not confirmed, but a lot of rising stars of the UNP, जो जयवर्धने की पार्टी हुआ करती थी उस वक्त जो ललित अतुराम मुरली और Gamani Dastanaike, they were also considered to be the people, both of whom were actually unfortunately assassinated later. Both of whom were considered to be to have provoked the violence that happened in Jaffna's library. Right? These were so. The point is that in order to be a rising star within the Sinhalese politics, you have to establish your credential as a hardliner first, and that paved the way for a lot of people. I mean, Jayavardhane was the president. उस समय प्रधानमंत्री जो थे रणसिंह प्रेमदासा उनके
तो
पारस
उसके मुझे जो हमने पहले जो राइट्स डिस्कस किए और ये जो पब्लिक
हम्म,
लाइब्रेरी
हम्म,
जलाना हुआ, तो
हम्म.
now what happens to the LTT now? And can we talk a bit about the Indian role and the assassination of Rajiv Gandhi? And later it led to a spate of like assassinations and counter assassinations even in Sri Lanka, right? For example, of RG of R Premadasa. So can we go to
Yes.
that part of history like in the 80s and the early 90s?
Sure, sure. So, as LTT, as I was saying, that it was vying for supremacy with the other Tamil factions, right? And at in India, there was an NGO government which was quite sympathetic to LTT at that time. LTT, the earliest breakout, and in fact, Indian government in particular was also sympathetic to the cause of LTT. Mostly after 1983. So 1983 July के बाद से भारतीय सरकार in general, they have been sympathetic and also been supportive of Tamil militancy around that, right? So a lot of training
After
of
the
Tamil
riots and the
cadres,
reburning and
and
so on. Okay.
yes, so after the riots, mostly Indian intelligence forces are supposed to have trained LTT and the other militant cadres around that time, and the different Tamil political parties have also been sympathetic, like the AIDMK की जो सरकार हुआ करती थी श्री MGR की जो सरकार थी, that was very sympathetic to LTT. And at that time, actually, the opponent in Tamil Nadu, Karunanidhi, Mr. Karunanidhi, he was more aligned towards Telo. Telo करके जो संगठन था, but actually, in that competitive era of Tamil militancy, LTT ultimately won, right? I think 1980s, उस दौरान LTT had almost started massacring people, massacring cadres from all other variant groups. However,
All will were-
the other factions still existed, but 87 में 80 1986 1987 में there was another militancy which sprouted in Sri Lanka. It had started earlier, but that grew at that time, 1986 and 87, where its worst areas, which was a JVP militancy. So JVP एक
What is the
संगठन था जो
militancy, right?
हाँ हाँ
Is that the Sinhalese counter
Yes,
militancy?
yes. The counter militants. I mean, call it counter or another form of militancy, but ये राष्ट्रवादी संगठन था, a Marxist राष्ट्रीय nationalist organization JVP, और उसके जो militant group थे, that was another worst outbreak of militancy. So the Sinhalese, where government was fighting on two fronts, like on against JVP and also on along with the Tamil militant groups. And so at that time they requested for India's support. Now, जैसे कि हमने बताया कि 1965 में डिस्ट्रिक्ट काउंसिल का जो कॉन्सेप्ट आया था, एंड देन सो as as a prerequisite for supporting the Sinhalese government, भारत सरकार ने बताया कि जरूर हम इसमें हस्ताक्षर करेंगे, बट आपको वो जो डिस्ट्रिक्ट काउंसिल है उसमें आपको इलेक्शन करवाना है। तो सम
हम्म,
फॉर्म ऑफ devolution of powers was proposed by India at that time. It was, of course, well meaning. We should not discredit the Indian government for that, but it was definitely one of the uh, uh, I mean, it was a non-starter to start with, क्योंकि
yeah.
जो इंडिया पीस इंडो श्रीलंकन जो पीस अकॉर्ड हुआ उस दौरान, सो LTT was ambivalent about it. The Tamil political leaders were ambivalent in India, were ambivalent about it, and yet mostly backed by the Indian intelligence and the top leadership of the Indian government. They pushed through this accord. जिस दौरान डिस्ट्रिक्ट काउंसिल्स में इंडिया वुड फैसिलिटेट इलेक्शन इन डिस्ट्रिक्ट काउंसिल्स, उसमें निर्वाचन होंगे, और निर्वाचन के लिए जो संगठन थे LTT को छोड़कर लगभग लगभग सारे जो ये सब
तमिल
गोष्ठी
संगठन।
थे, हाँ तमिल संगठन और गोष्ठी जो थे वो सभी ने उस उसमें पार्टिसिपेट किया। However, with the coming of so इंडिया ने उस दौरान एक्चुअली जो पीस
तो
कीपिंग
अभी
फोर्स
भी
था।
प्रेसिडेंट अभी कौन है अभी श्रीलंका में? इज इट स्टिल जयवर्धने?
Huh, it is still Jayabhadrani. We're talking about 1977. He stayed president, if I'm not wrong, until 1989. Right.
ओके।
So, 87, Jayabhadrani is the president. The prime minister is Ranasinghe Premadasa. And that's a fag end of Jayabhadrani's presidency that we're talking about. So, the Indian peacekeeping force comes. They try to uh, uh, disarm the LTT. Jo Tamil groups, their idea was to disarm. Initially, they were successful, but gradually the skirmishes with LTT grew, और डिस्ट्रिक्ट काउंसिल में उन्होंने फैसिलिटेट किया कि इलेक्शन होंगे। उस दौरान वहाँ पे विधायक चुनकर भी आए थे, वहाँ पे रिप्रेजेंटेटिव्स भी आए थे, बट as I mentioned, that was the worst phase of uh,
वायलेंस।
fratricidal Tamil violence. So LTT almost
Tamils killing
massacred.
other Tamils just because they're not towing the LTT line. Mostly the LTT carrying out
Right.
massacres become like the number one uh, Tamil force in northern Sri Lanka. Then
That's right. That's right. And in fact, the elections, the district council elections in northern and parts of eastern Sri Lanka, जहाँ पे actually Tamils बताने से Tamils उतने ज्यादा भी नहीं थे, but
हाँ।
the concept of LM जो LTT का और दूसरे तमिल संगठन का primary demand था, वो था LM, which makes up of parts of
तो
the Jaffna Peninsula and Eastern Peninsula. Yes.
ओके, तो श्रीलंकन गवर्नमेंट मान लेती है कि हम चुनाव कराएंगे या चुनाव होता है, बट ड्यूरिंग दोज इलेक्शंस देयर इज fratricidal violence. So now the Indian government peacekeeping force steps in to stop the LTT or disarm the LTT, and that creates this new LTT Indian government friction that ultimately leads to the assassination of Rajiv Gandhi.
Yes, very much true. In fact, Prabhakaran, let's say that Prabhakaran, Vellupillai Prabhakaran, the leader of LTT, he decides, apparently at that time, he decides uh, uh, to actually do away with Rajiv Gandhi around that time. Now, it was also perhaps one of the worst instances of brickmanship in Sri Lanka. The district councils, the erstwhile militant groups, excluding LTT, had won the district council elections. They had their representatives in that. And uh, Mr. Ranasinghe Premadasa, who was the prime minister until then, he becomes the president.
President of Sri
Now,
Lanka.
upon becoming the president, he actively starts. He of course wants to have the peacekeeping force out of Sri Lanka, and in order to do so, he does one of what we would say was one of the biggest examples of brinkmanship. So he known to most political leaders of the time, like Athura Murali uh, has acknowledged that, and he said that this was being done very actively, and he would be on also on the target. So Lalita Thuramulati, just to give, he was the defense minister, the deputy minister of defense और national security के minister थे, बहुत बड़े नेता थे,
बहुत
और
बड़े प्रेमदासा के ही डिफेंस मिनिस्टर थे,
deputy defense minister थे जी.
डिप्टी डिफेंस
So
मिनिस्टर।
Lalit Athuramuratti himself has said that Rana Singh Premadasa, जो तत्कालीन जो राष्ट्रपति थे, he is rearming LTTE. LTT को वो समर्थन दे रहे हैं, and LTT then ultimately
इंडियन
wipes out
पीसकीपिंग फोर्स
the
का
end complete.
वापस
Yeah,
itself.
the complete leadership in this district councils, and then which ultimately leads to Indian peacekeeping force going out of Sri Lanka. So we're talking about this time around 1991. तो भारत में भी जनरल इलेक्शंस होने वाले हैं, और निर्वाचन के पहले उस टाइम ऐसा लग रहा था कि शायद राजीव गांधी दोबारा से प्रधानमंत्री बनने वाले हैं, तो शायद प्रधानमंत्री बनने के साथ साथ दोबारा से वो पीस कीपिंग फोर्स को श्रीलंका भेज
Yes.
सकते हैं. So perhaps, and we cannot be sure in hindsight, but perhaps that could be one of the reasons. And I think there's already literature on that that suggests that Prabhakaran had made up his mind to actually assassinate Rajiv Gandhi just before this elections. Now, that surely didn't work out for Mr. Premadasa as well. He himself was assassinated. Lalit Murali, he was also assassinated, one of the post future caimans of leadership. और 1994 को फिर से वापस
Maybe ऐसा
इलेक्शन
है
हुआ.
कि मतलब there is a tale of backdoor dealings and so on that we can go on later. I think this is a story in itself.
Absolutely, yes. I mean, I mean, you get the biggest examples of brinkmanship in Sinhalese history in Ranasinghe Premadasa's time. But Choranbe, as I was saying, that after his death as well, that 1994 elections happened. Again, उस दौरान चंद्रिका कुमारतुंगा, जो श्रीलंकन फ्रीडम पार्टी मिस्टर बंदर नायके की बेटी चंद्रिका कुमारतुंगा, उनके हस्बैंड को एक्चुअली विजय कुमारतुंगा को 1980s में, लेट 1980s में, he was assassinated by the JVP militants, Sinhalese militants जो थे. He was considered to be moderate within the Sinhalese Sri Lankan Freedom Party, और उन्हीं के उनकी जो धर्मपत्नी मिस चंद्रिका कुमारतुंगा, वो 94 के
So
इलेक्शन में वो चुनकर आई.
Chandrika Kumaratunga's father as well as husband was kind of like assassinated by two different factions, but like Sinhalese nationalists. One more religious, the other more Marxist-Leninist.
Yeah, I mean, Mr. Vijay Kumartunga was a popular actor. He was a moderate, and he we can't say in hindsight what would have, in retrospect, what could have happened, but perhaps one of the Sri Lankan Freedom Party would have certainly taken a different route, a different idea. However, Ms. Chandrika Kumaratunga herself, to be fair to her, she did try to restore a semblance of order in Sri Lanka. She tried to reapproach the Tamil groups and LTT, and she tried to establish reconciliation with them, but then the pact broke down. The
Also,
Tamils, the
stepped
Tamil
in.
Tigers.
Norway stepped in around this time, right? Like the Norway was the third party in the talks.
Yeah, I mean that was Norway ultimately stepped into it in 2000s, early
Yeah.
2000s, and until then there was actually several round of Tamil suicidal attacks. Chandrika Kumaratunga herself was attacked, or those are I think 2001 or 2003, I'm not sure when, but Sri Lankan airport में भी attack हुआ on the anniversary of those July riots, anti-Tamil July riots, right? On this anniversary, उसमें one of the worst attacks on Sinhalese International, the only international airport in Sri Lanka, and the Norwegians, they do intervene. They try to उस दौरान बहुत ज़्यादा वार्ता होता है अलग-अलग
लेकिन
देशों में.
इस समय जो 90s का समय जो था उस समय
Mhm.
एलटीटी की ताकत जो थी in terms of the brute power that they possess, they were giving a very hard time to the Sri Lankan security establishment, right? Like in the late 80s and the 90s.
Yeah, I mean, certainly it had its own female. Just consider this, like LTT is also considered to be the father of several insurgencies across the world, right? उन्होंने मिडिल ईस्ट में जो संगठन थे, पहले तो पैलेस्टीनियन ग्रुप्स उन सब से they also helped out the LTT in its early days, but later LTT itself has helped a lot of terrorist groups across this Middle East. So just consider this. It also, at one time, Thailand, most probably in Thailand, they had their own submarines. They started working on a submarine of their own,
They
right? So
had the
they had
aircraft,
their, they
so on.
had,
They also started working
yeah,
on a submarine. Okay.
Yeah, the naval, they had their own naval force, they had their or air command. So, and they ran their own government. It was they ran sort of a civilian government in northern and eastern Sri Lanka. तो उन्होंने उनके पुस्तक भी आए थे, where they used to edify the historic Tamil figures.
Yeah.
There are several examples of like social science textbooks that you will still find around.
So they
So
were running
LTD, yes,
one, right, in those areas at that time.
absolutely, absolutely.
So and then
So
we have the Rajapaksas come in, right? Like in
yes, I
this.
mean slightly before the Rajapaksa actually. So there was a second election. So Chandrika Kumartunge wasn't given an extension, and then the Ranil. So that election where Mr. Rajapaksa won was उस दौरान actually UNP के जो candidate थे वो रानिल विक्रमसिंघे थे जो जयवर्धने के भांजे हैं और SLFP मिस्टर चंद्रिका कुमार तुंगा और बंदर नायकी की जो पार्टी है उसके कैंडिडेट थे राजपक्षे. It was a very similar election because Mr. Rajapaksa was a conservative, whereas Mr. Ranil Wickremesinghe was considered who's the current president of Sri Lanka was considered to be a moderate. However, the
Uh,
Tamil parties have completely boycotted that election.
yeah, let me bring this to perspective, right? So you have Vikramasinghe, who is basically from Jayawardena's party, right? I-
Yes,
I-
the
And,
UNP.
and you have Rajapaksa, who is basically from Kumartunga Bandaranaike's party. But the thing is, like, the roles are kind of reversed. They are going more tough on LTT, and the other party is going more moderate on the LTT.
That's correct. Yes, I mean Mr. Wickremesinghe. He was in 2000 actually the first time there was a president who was from a different party. Ms. Kumaratunga and the prime minister was from another party. Mr. Wickremesinghe. So that was the first time that happened. And then जब उसके बाद जब इलेक्शन हुआ जिसमें मिस्टर राजापक्षे जो राष्ट्रपति बने, he won by a very narrow margin. उसके पहले just before the elections, the LTT literally boycotts the elections, right? So जो शायद जो मिस्टर विक्रमसिंघे को जो समर्थन मिलने वाला था तमिल एरिया से उनको नहीं मिला,
Hmm.
and Mr. Rajapaksa won that election by a very narrow margin, and we all know what happened after that. Like the LTT, of course, that was the break. उसी दौरान actually
Yeah,
Colonel Karuna का breakaway faction आया LTT से, and
LTT
yes,
also kind of like led to its own demise in that way. By allowing
absolutely.
Rajapaksa to win, by not allowing Tamils to vote, who would probably have voted for Vikram Singh, that allowed Rajapaksa to start a very tough and very aggressive policies. And can we just like end with the end of the war? Like what happened and how did the LTT ultimately collapse?
Yeah, sure. So then we know that in 2009 में the final outbreak of war happened, and then when LTT was completely wiped out. So उसके just पहले 2006 में actually the first major breakaway faction of LTT led by Colonel Karuna, जिनका नाम है वो he broke away from LTT. They also I mean Prabhakaran termed him as a traitor, and उस दौरान actually India का support भी बहुत ज़्यादा कम हो गया था. Like immediately after Rajiv Gandhi's death, there was almost decline in Indian support against the Tamil insurgents. As you know that जब वो तमिल और 1990 के दशक में जब तमिल के फ्रैट्रिसाइडल तमिल वायलेंस हैपेंड बिटवीन द डिफरेंट तमिल मिलिटेंट ग्रुप्स, तो उसका प्रभाव देश में भी पड़ा. सलेम जो तमिलनाडु में जो एक छोटा शहर है वहां पे भी तमिल ग्रुप्स के बीच में मुठभेड़ हुए थे जहां पे टेलो के कैडर्स एलटीटी के लोगों द्वारा मारे गए थे, राइट? So that decline happened, and then in 2006, after that breakaway faction, so it was a downfall from there. Um, Mr. Rajapaksa himself was a hardliner, and then the support for the LTT from the Tamil diaspora across different countries that was also stopped. LTT's funds were tamped down. बहुत सारे देशों में LTT was declared as a terrorist organization, which wasn't the case in the 80s, let's say. So ultimately, yes, the final phase of the war in 2009, and we see the end of Prabhakaran
Yeah,
and almost the
that was
entire
brutal war.
leadership of ITP.
You had
Yeah.
you had like widespread allegations of human rights violation against the Sri Lankan troops, and you had this kind of like complete annihilation of the LTT. But a lot of people were also caught in the crossfire. sometimes like there have been allegations that those were deliberate, and it's not really just being caught in the crossfire. It was just like a deliberate attempt to finish this problem once and for all.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, a lot of people, refugees, people rendered homeless.
Yeah.
We see the repetition of the 1983 in 2009 as well. The people lost homes. They have still not been rehabilitated. India partially supported them after, most recently, I think, a couple of years ago, they did send another rehabilitation package. But as of now, one of the primary demands of डेवोल्यूशन स्टिल रिमेन्स अनफुलफिल्ड जो डिस्ट्रिक्ट काउंसिल की बात है जो उनको पावर देने की बात है वो अभी भी वो पूर्ण रूप से वो डिमांड माने नहीं गए हैं और देयर वाज सम एक्सपेक्टेशन दैट आफ्टर द कमिंग ऑफ विक्रम सिंह रणवीर विक्रम सिंह दोबारा से उस पर बात होगी बट दैट हैज बीन पुट इनटू कोल्ड स्टोरेज अगेन
There are different problems now. There is the economic problem that Sri Lanka is facing, which is
श्योरली
probably the major problem right now. But in some ways, the wounds have healed, but like not there are still like grievances. If that way. Thank you so much again. It was a very nice conversation. I think it's time to like stop here.
ऑलराइट थैंक यू